good to go now, Phil.
Thanks, Sue. Let's open this Finance, Audit and Risk Committee meeting open. Welcome to our Zoom meeting. I'm not sure how long we're going to be like this, but thank you for your indulgence for all the mistakes we're going to make along the way through this until we get used to having formal meetings by Zoom again. Apologies, I don't believe we have any apologies. Councillor Allen, I think you're here and present, so no need to apologise. I'm not aware of any public participation, so there are no apologies, no public participation. I'm not aware of any late items. No late items. Declarations of conflict of interest for items on the agenda. There aren't. Oh, Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Listen, item 7.4, page 110 of the agenda. Items reference CS1 and CS2, emergency management. I will step away from that conversation. Should there be any?
Should there be any? Thank you. Next item, item 5, confirmation of our minutes held 30th of June. Can I have a mover, please? Thank you. Member Jackson, do I have a seconder? I was going to say Councillor Lydia, but thank you, Councillor Allen. Any discussion? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those against, carried. Our first item, 7.1. Oh, there are no announcements. 7.1, health and safety report, pages 7 to 50 of substantial report. I'm just looking for on the screen. I think Tanya's the go-to person on this one. Welcome, Tanya. Thank you for the extensive report, and Ashley. You want to just talk through highlights, key messages, any updates? I think probably change in status in terms of alert level might be appropriate. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I will take the report as read. However, there are a few points to note. As of 11:59 on Tuesday, the 17th of August, all of New Zealand was put into alert level 4 after a community case was found in Auckland of the coronavirus, of the COVID-19, and now we know it is the Delta variant, which is highly spreadable and contagious. We moved very quickly into lockdown, and the incident management team has been activated at HDC. So that's probably the main part of the change of the report.
Thank you for that. I'll take the report as read. Are there any comments slash questions, clarification? Member Brian, thank you.
Chairman, I just wondered if there could be a little bit more comment about behaviour. I know that on the KCDC committee, there's some concerns in that area about behaviour, and I just wondered how we're dealing with that. I know it's covered on the in the paper, but it seems to me that it's an issue that needs quite a lot of attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, as it certainly has been quite a intense time for that behaviour. As far as health and safety and support for our staff internally, we have had, in January 2020, we facilitated crisis resilience training for our facilities, so for the Levin and Foxton facilities. And we also, at that same time, the following day, facilitated crisis resilience through OPSEC, the company, resilience training for all our staff, which were invited into the chambers, and it covered HDC staff, Horowhenua Alliance and Aquatics and other facility staff that wanted to attend that. We also have training underway, planning for training underway with the facilities. That was happening just before the lockdown time. So that will be with a different provider that the Wairarapa and Wellington councils have used and recommended. And so that's entitled the Personal Safety Forum, and it covers situational awareness, personal safety, conflict de-escalation, disengaging, recognising signs of stress, and developing resilient strategies. So hopefully that will, once this present situation passes, will be brought in for our staff. Security has been increased in the facilities during the time of the behaviour from the youth, and Māori wardens are present in the facilities opening hours also. The libraries and hubs, full meetings and team meetings are held regularly. Discussion around mental health and how staff are feeling is brought up at all of these meetings. And they also had a visit from the Mayor, Bernie Wandin, and Chief Executive David Clapperton to reassure the staff that they are well supported and recognised when situations have been getting tough. The EAP, which is the Employee Assistance Program, is available at all times, and it is reminded and offered at meetings, and in the staff rooms there's information available. And these incidents around the facilities have significantly dropped since a core member of the group of youths causing the initial problems have been dealt with by the police. And to date, there were 6 youth were trespassed within this current behaviour that was happening. There have been various incidents reported around this threatening behaviour. They come in through our People Safe reporting system from our staff. And it's important to note that we keep our internal staff safe, but also we're responsible for people in the community to keep them safe, and are often working multi-agency, in this situation, the police, and they've responded supportively. And we know it's also been a focus for the Community Wellbeing Committee on that front.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Joe?
Thank you, Member Jackson, for that question. That was an important question and a really fulsome answer. Just one supplementary in response to that. We have a large group of volunteers who support a lot of the work that happens in our community centres, particularly Te Tākaritanga Okurahopo. I wondered if there was any thought given to the possibility, because I really like the concept as you described it for the training that's available, and the situational awareness and all of that sort of thing that's important when you're dealing with some of these really difficult situations. Is it possible that volunteers or people who regularly attend library as volunteers would be included in that training, just to spread that capability more broadly across the service?
Short answer, I would encourage that and say yes, but that will be something I would discuss with the facility managers. But I think that's I've just jotted that down on my notes to make sure I don't forget.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from councillors? Councillor Christine?
Thank you. I'd just like to acknowledge the improvement in the Safe Plus report and say congratulations to Tania and her team. It looks like you've done a huge amount of work since the last one. So well done.
Thank you. Councillor Victoria? You're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Sorry about
yes,
that.
Yep. That's all right.
I'm just wondering, as the Chair of Community Wellbeing, if I could give a little bit of an update about some of the work that's currently happening in that space.
Absolutely.
That's okay. So
Fine,
back in June, as you're aware, we had a youth network meeting, and it was agreed that the task force group meeting was required to address the current youth issues that we were having in and around our CBD. So as we have had a wide range of community working within our youth sector, this was shown through an extremely large turnout at our very first hui that we had. And it was supported by an extremely robust and often very emotive discussions around this topic. So some points that were made at that first hui were around our community needing to continue to log all calls to ensure that data was collected for help and more resourcing in that space. And I'm not sure if Tania had mentioned, because I'd lost a bit of sound there, but at one point the police were called up to 3 times in one day to 3 separate incidences at Te Tākiritanga Hukurahopo. So work is currently being done with our tamariki in rangatahi and their whānau. The gangs still continue to actively recruit our youth in these spaces, unfortunately. Not all families involved display dysfunction or a lack of care was noted at our first meeting, and most behaviour is happening outside of school hours. Schools have identified that there needs to be far more social service support in schools. Some of those outcomes included the task force group for intensive targeted work with tamariki, rangatahi and whānau. And iwi and services are to take the lead, and council can assist by helping to set up the group and its terms of reference and its MOUs, as certain providers do not have the resources or skills to enable this currently. Then that helps the group becoming self-moderating in itself. Another hui was held in August in a workshop setting, and this was to discuss solutions for the much wider group of the rangatahi that could be implemented collectively through all these social services. So mapping of local youth services to include resources and skills, that the solutions and action-based plans can be shared with other organisations. And best way forward is to keep everything in line with the social work and clinical perspective and support the desired direction that the facilitators wish to engage all the groups thinking for all solutions and strategic plans that they're putting together currently. Our next hui will occur as soon as we're able. It was supposed to be last Friday. This will be facilitated by 2 of the social service agencies, and Te Puni Kokiri will be presenting at this hui also. This will be supported by HDC and myself as the Chair of Community Wellbeing. So rest assured there is a lot of work happening regarding this topic, and I did hear the mention of the use of Māori wards in our Māori wardens in our open space and Te Tākiri, and it's made a huge difference. And I was wondering if there was an update around giving them some sort of authorisation to be able to implement the bylaw around liquor ban and smoking in those public spaces. I know it was talked about, but I wasn't quite sure where it had got to. Thanks.
Is someone able to update Councillor Victoria on that, or we leave it for after the meeting?
I can provide an update after the meeting. I'll find out for you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions on the report? I've just got a couple of comments. I think Councillor Christine has already highlighted this is a good report, and I actually like the information that was contained within the extensive report. Now, I understand that there was supposed to be another review happening earlier this week. It's been obviously delayed, and at this stage, I imagine that we've got no idea when that's likely to be rescheduled, because who knows what next week is going to happen next month. So I think that's good. I think it'll be just useful just next meeting, if you could just give us a bit of an update as to the progress on the subsequent visit would be not necessarily the outcomes, but has it happened? When is it happening? The other thing I do like is we've got out in section 6 on page 10 is basically your significant risks, the top 6. It would be useful to actually, over a period of time, enhance that reporting, and maybe I'll have a discussion offline about how we can actually enhance that reporting. As we've talked about, people and behaviour at the moment is of topical information. There has been some risk for our staff and how that's been mitigated. So just for those big ones, what's the current state and what are we doing would probably be useful. The last comment I think is really important. In the report on page 28, I just want to highlight, which is page 13 of the report. And I think this is important, and this is part of good risk management. And this is not untypical of what happens is in the middle of that page on page 28 of the agenda, page 13 of the report, in the middle it says some risk controls were being monitored, but the effectiveness of controls is not being verified. And I think that's critical with any risk management, and that maybe next time we can actually talk about how those controls are being monitored and verified going forward. But again, I'm really pleased to see where we are in terms of health and safety. I can only thank the Chief Executive because he's the only employee that we have, but I think it's a team effort. Well done, Mr. Chief Executive and your team. Any further discussion, comments? Otherwise, we go back to the agenda, back to page 7. We've got 2 recommendations there. Do I have a mover for those recommendations, please? Thank you, Mayor Burney, and seconded Councillor Victoria. Any further discussion? All those in favour, please say aye or raise your hand. Right. Carried. Our next item is, thank you very much, Tanya and Ashley, for your work you're doing. And our next item is the Korowhena Alliance, page 51. You scroll down there at a high speed. Do we have someone reporting on this one, David? Or oh, David, you're welcome, David. Can't see your face. Are there any highlights, changes since the report that you want to comment on? Take the report as read. Questions? Councillor Jennings, then Councillor Wayne.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question in relation to 3.3. There's obviously a reference there to the June heavy rainfall event. And I guess I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't more of a report around the impact on our water treatment facility as a result of that event. And I just wanted, my question really is, are we going to be receiving a report around that particular event, and that takes us through, I guess, what happened and some of the learnings that we've taken, and perhaps some of the mitigations that will be put in place to avoid that occurring again?
Do we have a comment, David? Either David. We can't hear you, David York. Sorry, it still can't. Perhaps we can follow up after the meeting due to technical issues. Let's try again, David. No, sorry. Okay. Welcome to Zoom. Councillor Wayne.
Thank you, Chair. On the same point as Councillor Jennings, Mr. Chair, look, my query was because we were involved in the projects committee who put one of our key projects was to put in place the clarifier up there. And I'm pleased to read that despite heavy rain events, the restricted water supply across the district at the beginning of the month, we still met the drinking water standards. So my question really is that I suppose it'll come out in the report that Councillor Jennings referred to, was that one, is the clarifier that we put up there fit for purpose? Is it right sized? And two, what was the main reason for the restricted access of water across the district during that heavy rainfall event? I'm thinking it was back in the beginning of June.
Thank you, Councillor Wayne.
So through you, Chair. So it's unfortunate that David York can't respond, and we'll just see if we can sort out that technical difficulty. So taken on board both of the queries that have been raised by Councillor Jennings and by Councillor Bishop, and I'll undertake just to follow that up, and it may very well be by way of an email response after the meeting.
Thank you.
On both of those. I'm pretty sure that the answer to the question that Wayne you have, or Councillor Bishop you have around the clarifier is a positive one, but I'll get some more clarification around the matter that you've raised, Councillor Jennings.
Hera.
How's my volume?
You're great.
Okay. I guess I read this brief report, and what comes to mind for me is that looks like, I mean, great, and some positive comments passed on already, but I read that and think there's very little to no attention on stormwater. So am I reading this wrong? Or like, even if you look at the maintenance things, there's sewer, obviously, and I know this is nothing specific in regards to stormwater, unless I'm missing something.
Again, point taken, Councillor Tukapua. I'll undertake just to discuss that with David York and just see what information can be provided by way of the updates that come back to the FAR committee on an ongoing basis. I'm pretty sure that there is monitoring that we can provide, even if it's around the resource consent process that we're going through. That may very well be a project steering group committee or a project steering group discussion at some point, but I'll just follow up again that with David York after the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Executive. Any other questions, comments on this report? Therefore, if we go back to page 51, we've got a couple of recommendations there. Do I have
just before you carry on, Mr. Jones, could you just, Christine, Councillor Mitchell's just got a query.
Thank you. You're moving around the screen on me, Christine.
Yeah, okay, I've got my mute on though. Just 3.2 KPI update, the Three Waters program works. The graph shows that less than 60% of the planned jobs were completed, but I know through asking the question earlier that in fact that was incorrectly calculated and it's 90%. So I just wanted that made known. Thanks.
Thank you. David Clapperton, do you want to just sort of go through how the 90% was arrived at, just for clarification purposes, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Look, I'll just read out the comment that, or the response, the query that was raised by Councillor Mitchell. The figure of 60% shown is incorrect, and it is a calculated average over the three water activities. In this case, the average has been calculated incorrectly. It should read 90%. 100% of the planned wastewater jobs were completed during the period, and 80% of the planned water jobs were completed during the period. There were no planned stormwater jobs scheduled for the period, hence the average over those two activities being 90%.
Thank you. Any further questions? I'll pause this time before I ask for a mover. I can't see any, so can I have a mover for the recommendation? Thank you, Councillor Christine. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor David. Any further comments? All those in favour, please say aye. Raise your hand. Aye, carried. Our next item is our Customer and Strategy Activity Update, page 53. So I think we've got Megan, Vi, and I thought I saw the other David sitting on the screen for a minute in terms of any, David McCorkindale, any other questions? Just take the report as read. Are there any further information or updates or points of clarification?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd just like to just point out an error in the report picked up by Councillor Mitchell. On page 55, it says that subdivision consents increased by 11.8%, whereas it should have said that they had decreased by that value, and that error is also in the text on page 56.
Thank you. Any other questions? No other. Oh, Christine, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so planning 3.6. There are talks about being improvements made to the conflict of interest processes, and I just wondered if Megan could explain a bit more about what's happening there, please.
Sure. We have put in a more robust conflict of interest process specific to the resource consenting process. So that relates to conflicts that could be either perceived or actual conflict of interest relating to the processing of the consents. So that might be where a consent is applied for by a staff member or by an elected member, or where a staff member has some kind of financial interest or personal interest in an application, and it's really just to get that documented. And we have some mitigation steps that we have established in advance that we can put in place in relation to those consents.
Thank you. Does that satisfy you, Christine? Councillor Jennings.
Thank you.
Just a quick question on page, oh, actually I don't have the page reference. I think it's 3.1 and 3.3 and 3.4, where it talks about just the not meeting in a small number of cases the statutory timeframes for processing of consents, that kind of thing. And I just really wanted to understand what's the consequence, or what happens in that type of situation in terms of the applicant? Is there a refund of fees, waiving of fees, or what actually happens in those specific cases where we don't meet that timeline?
So with regards to resource consents, we follow the process that's outlined in the RMA discount regulations, which means that we provide a discount of 1% of the total cost per day that the consent is over the statutory timeframe. And for building consents, that's not the case. But I guess you could say that the impact of having consents go over time is probably a bit more serious, in that we are accredited to provide that service, and so that's kind of the real motivator to make sure they're within the timeframes.
Answer the question, Councillor Sam. Thank you. Any other questions, Councillor David?
Look, I referred to 3.9, the earthquake-prone buildings. What sort of feedback have we had? Obviously, people wouldn't necessarily be happy to receive that information, but what sort of feedback have we got to date from those building owners?
Initially, we had quite a number of inquiries that had come through from building owners. Majority of those inquiries were about what it means for them. But once having explained the process through to those building owners, those sort of inquiries faded away really quickly. It has been quite a period of time between the last communications with those building owners and these most recent ones. So it was really just reassuring building owners around what part of the process we were at.
That's very, very helpful. Thanks, Vi.
Are there any other questions? I've got one. Oh, did you hear it? Is that a question or was it a...
Sorry, I did show my hand because I had one, and then I thought I'd take this question offline, but it's too late now, I'll just say it. How many of those regarding the earthquake-prone buildings are locally owned versus owned by people that don't live here? If that was to your knowledge.
Thanks for the question, Councillor Shakura. Unfortunately, that sort of information we haven't looked into. It's really just been about who owns the building and making sure that we get the right information to the right people. But I can look into that and see what information we might be able to get together for you offline.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I've got one. It's probably more aimed at the Chief Executive in terms of, it looks like our activity is increasing, and that's a steady increase and probably no let up. So with the constrained workforce that everyone's aware of, the pressure of, dare I say it, poaching from other entities, what are the risks that this council faces, particularly in the regulatory, the consent with space and both consent, both building and resource consents? If you want to just give us, the committee, a bit of an update on that, would be appreciated.
So if I can answer that, but could I just also ask Megan if she can just give the councillors just a perspective of some of the things that we're doing at the moment to look at, or initiatives that we're actually looking at to improve our resourcing, and I'll come back and just highlight some of the challenges that we have just with the current economic environment.
Sorry. So there are a number of things that we are doing to try and resolve capacity issues. One of which is retaining our current staff, and that's by being a good employer, and we have flexible working policy in place that is there to give staff good life balance. We also are looking at, we're doing some fairly robust recruitment at the moment. We have been running some campaigns that have actually been quite successful in some areas, probably not so much in others. And we're also looking at other ways of delivering services in terms of, for example, if we can't get sufficient resource management planners and we're having to utilise contractors, there's a lot of workload associated with managing the contractors and keeping on top of where they're at with the work. And so we're looking at potentially using a resource rather than having a planning vacancy, planning role vacant. We're looking at getting somebody to assist with coordinating the consents that are with contractors at present. So trying to look at other ways that we can support the team if we can't actually recruit to some of those roles.
Okay, so just to add to that, Mr. Chair, it's an area of concern, just in terms of, one, the increased volumes that we're experiencing, and this has been prevalent over the last probably 12, 18 months, but also just some of the challenges that we are facing as a result of this, skilled labour shortage. And we have seen on a number of occasions other parties within the sector who are, second building and planning people being able to offer packages that we can't compete with. And as Megan's indicated, we're looking at initiatives that we can put in place to not only retain our existing staff, which is probably just as important as recruiting, but also initiatives that might be able to or allow us to attract staff. And I have approved through David McCorkindale, or the group manager of this area, to increase our resources. And the challenge is actually getting those resources in place. Look, everyone's facing the same problem, and it is something that we need to be very cognizant of.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Joe and then Councillor Wayne. Deputy Mayor Joe.
Thank you, and thank you both to Megan and David for that very candid response, because I know it's a challenge. Mine's a supplementary question to that. Is the challenges that we're having with recruiting from overseas and the closure to the border, is that with skilled workers, is that something that's having an added impact on the ability to employ those staff that we need?
I'm not sure if it's the same.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Go on, David.
It is having an impact. A lot of countries are, a lot of councils are in the same situation, trying to find these resources. And whereas a certain number would have been able to be attracted from overseas, we're now all competing essentially locally, or for those that are returning home. So it does have an impact. And essentially, there seems to be a smaller number coming through the planning. If we take planning as an example, there's a smaller number coming through the planning schools and university. So the actual number of graduates that are there is fewer as well, to the extent where a lot of the graduates basically have roles going into their fourth and final year, whereas going back some time, obviously it was quite competitive. Trying to get a job, it was quite hard work coming out of university. There was quite you had to work hard to get a job essentially. Now they're able to basically get one lined up, often getting into councils well before they finish their studies and starting in some form even before they finish their qualifications, such as the demand.
Thank you, David McCorkindale. Any other? David Clappenden, you got any other comments to make on Joe's comment before I go to Wayne? No. Okay, Wayne.
Thank you, Chair. Look, we've heard this narrative for a couple of months now, where there is pressure on the organisation to deliver, and let me assure you that's right across the whole stretch of the supply chain, certainly in the housing sector. So the question really needs to be put is that how are we tracking against our projections are our projections within reach, or do we need to reset maybe some of our assumptions, given that we don't seem to be able to sufficiently address some of these issues?
The paragraph just above 5.2 in the report attempts to cover that to a certain extent. So just to go there, the long-term plan that we recently adopted forecasts 352 new dwellings for the current financial year. So breaking that down into what that would be each month, that would come to 29 new dwelling units. So for the month of July, which this report's about, we had 46 new dwelling units. So at the moment, we're consenting above what the forecasting assumption is, but clearly we're going to have to keep an eye on that. The current context of COVID will obviously have some sort of impact. Last year, we thought that was going to have quite a significant impact. In the end, we had a bumper year in terms of what came through, but we don't quite know. So we will keep an eye on that. Certainly the number of consents was high in July. Some of that could have been down to what we call the gold rush effect with the implementation of the development contributions policy, people trying to put in applications in late June and get them in and things like that. So I think the next couple of months, we're always going to be telling, perhaps even more so now that we're experiencing a lockdown.
Thank you, David. Any other questions, comments?
Chairman?
Yeah, thank you. Yep, thank you. Member Jackson?
I thought there might be some opportunities from people from Afghanistan at the moment, Chairman.
We'll follow that up, Mr. Chair.
I'm not sure whether their building standards are the same as New Zealand and their Resource Management Act. Anyway, moving on. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? So if we go to page 53, we've got a couple of recommendations there. Do I have a mover, please? Thank you, Councillor Todd, seconded by Councillor Victoria. Any further discussion? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Or show of hands, aye. Carried. Our next item is the largest component, being our 12-month financial report for the 12 months. And probably I want to take this in two parts. We'll do the financial part to begin with, and then we'll go into the detail of each activity and non-financial. Jacinta, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'd start by, I'll take the report as read, but just highlight here that we're at a stage now with the results for the year where everything is included in the numbers, with the exception of some of the reserve movements. We're still finalizing those. So within equity, some of the reserves and the resulting internal interest numbers to each activity. So in terms of the annual results that we'll be reporting in the annual report, this should be what the result is, with the exception of some reserve movements and internal interest, which will be finalized over the coming days. As well, I just wanted to highlight that in terms of the annual report, this picture is what will flow into the annual report, but in terms of our auditors, they have delayed the timing of their audit until late October, unfortunately. So we won't be actually coming to you with a full annual report until late November. So what we're planning to do at this stage is to present that to you in September so that you can get the full view, even though it's not yet audited. So just a wee update on that side of things. But in terms of the results, I guess what I'd like to just highlight is it has been a really good result for us in terms of the completion of the capital program from a growth perspective. In terms of what David mentioned earlier, we did meet our 2.1% growth in terms of the number of houses. So from a rating perspective, leading into next year, it was a good result. And then in terms of the operating result, if you take out the impact of the capital grants and things, we ended up with a sort of an underlying surplus of around 800,000, which we'll be reporting through in terms of the annual report. So where we haven't needed to spend money, we haven't from an operating perspective. So that's good, taking into account as well that we had some extra depreciation coming through from the three waters. So that's something else that you'll see in terms of the results as well. So those are probably some of the key highlights that I just wanted to mention, and happy to take questions from here.
Thank you. Are there questions of our CFO? Councillor Sam?
Jacinta, thank you so much. And look, I apologise, I didn't email this through beforehand, but maybe that needs to be taken offline after the meeting. But I just went back to the annual plan document that we approved last year. And my understanding is that we approved at the time a $25 million capital program, but that obviously then some bigger projects came along through the essentially the COVID projects and some other projects that came online and obviously additional grant funding. And so I just was trying to sort of work out or track in terms of that original capital program, whether the carryovers are essentially the projects or the component of that original capital program that wasn't completed. And I guess my question really is, will this, in terms of the final annual report, will there be some explanation that I guess shows things in terms of that original capital program, and then obviously the impacts of those additional projects coming post approval of the annual plan, just so that we can actually track what where we're at in terms of that original capital expenditure program.
Sure, and yes, you do always have the change from when you move through from an annual plan, and there might be subsequent additional budgets approved and or carry forwards. So you're right from that perspective. And yes, in terms of the annual report at a more detailed level within each activity, there will be that reconciliation or that analysis of annual plan, additional budget approved, and then where we've spent money, where we haven't necessarily planned it to be spent. Yeah. Does that answer what you're asking?
Look, it does in part, but I think I'll annoy you offline. So, yeah. Thanks.
Sure, but you should absolutely have that picture in terms of what you're asking. The annual report should be able to answer those questions.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Member Jackson?
Chairman, on if I can refer people to page 77, just the fact that our equity has had a major increase and is now sitting at 82%, which I think is pretty darn good.
Maybe the CFO might want to just talk about why it's looking so good and what are the risks going forward with that wonderful increase in equity.
I'm sure she wouldn't want to spoil the story, Chairman.
Sure. So really, the increase in equity is driven, the majority of it is driven by the increase in our three waters assets. So as when we finished the long-term plan, WSP did an external audit of the values of our three water assets, and they were very close to doubling in terms of value. And so that's what we talked about when we finalized the LTP. That will be audited as part of the annual report. The auditors have already looked at it, but it is a significant increase in terms of the value that we have of our assets, and then that flows through into increasing equity as well. With that though, from a risk perspective, in terms of your question, Chair, is around the ongoing cost of providing for our three waters assets. And that is in and around the depreciation impact, as well as the cost of maintenance and capital expenditure.
But Chairman, it also puts us in a much better position for negotiating with the possible three waters situation.
I won't comment on the negotiations because I'm not sure if it will be a negotiation. I'll leave it at that.
But when we do come to you with the briefing around three waters, we'll make sure we're preparing some slides at the moment, but make sure you can see clearly what council's asset, liability, borrowings, equity, what the whole picture is both with and without water. So you get a good understanding.
Thank you.
I've got a comment, and I know the answer, but I think it's important we that everyone understands it. If we go back to page 62 on the agenda, and we've got the additional grant funding, I think it's if you just want to explain how we're managing the overs and unders there in terms of there are some projects that we haven't spent all the money yet, and what's the program? Do we have to give it back, or is there more money to spend? Can we just have some commentary on that? I think that's quite important.
Sure. So in some projects, such as, for example, the Mahi space, where we have funding that goes over a number of years, where we haven't spent all of the money in this last financial year, we've effectively made sure that we haven't recorded all of that as revenue, and some of that will come into this financial year when we are planning on doing or spending the funding. So we've made sure with the activity managers that we haven't effectively lost the revenue in terms of making sure it's recorded in the appropriate year of when the spending is going to happen.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Christine?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 75, it talks about stormwater activity being 266,000 K under in revenue due to lower interest income on special funds, and that just doesn't seem quite right to me. Could Jacinta please explain, how we can possibly be that far under? There must be other reasons.
No, and what I should have done is I should have explained it in the report. So that the interest for the special funds hasn't actually been, that's the bit that hasn't been recorded appropriately in the accounts yet. So it doesn't actually change the bottom line, but that interest income on special funds hasn't yet been recorded within that activity as it should be. So that's the last bit that we need to do. But in addition to that, that's about half of that variance, or just over half. And then the other portion of it relates to, in the annual plan, there was an assumption that there was slightly higher increase in revaluation or increase in the value of assets within stormwater. Slightly more was put into the stormwater activity than the other waters. And so it looks a little bit funny in the stormwater activity in terms of that revaluation.
Okay, cool. And could you also explain what a cancelled assessment is too, please, and the rate status?
Yep, sure. So if there is, for example, in certain circumstances, there might be a subdivision and two of the old rate accounts, if either there's been a mistake through the subdivision process or certain accounts are amalgamated and old ones are put to the side and a new one is created, then there may be there are certain assessments that are cancelled. In terms of the ones that you see there, there are some in the Hokio area, Māori freehold land properties that are sitting with some balances on them. And so that's what you see when you look at that rates debtors balance, and you see particularly the ones with the balance, I think it's around 140,000. That's currently sitting there with a balance, not specifically related just to those properties, but those effectively are what cancelled assessments mean. So in a lot of circumstances, they're not yet through the stage of, there might be some where in early July and August, we're working through the process of finalizing the accounts and setting the rates. So some will be fixed through this next couple of months, but weren't quite fixed when we got to the end of July.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Can we then go to page 62? I understand you've got some updated or circulated some updated information on the carry forwards. So just we can talk about those, because I think we need a specific resolution on the carry forwards.
Yes, thank you. So I hope everyone, I sent an email out just around 2 o'clock before the meeting, just proposing some updated wording for the carry forward. So I had sent, so in the report, there was a summary of the carry forwards. Subsequent to that, there was some more work done around, for example, the Lake Horowhenua project, and also some in the wastewater space, I believe, where Lake Horowhenua, the money was approved through the long-term plans. And so the advice coming back from officers to me was that additional money wasn't also needed in terms of that project. And then also in regards to the wastewater, some of that had changed. So that was then reducing that carry forward down to 1.87 million. But in regards to that 1.87 million, 1.6 of it is strictly what you would call a carry forward in terms of there was budget assigned to those. But in terms of the $250,000 for the Foxton Beach Surf Lifesaving Club, that didn't actually have specific budget assigned to it. So it would be more appropriate to determine that was additional budget rather than a carry forward specifically. And I also noted within that recommendation that 150,000 of that money was also would be funded externally. So just to point that out as well. So it's, while we need to put the budget in there for 250, 150,000 of it's actually coming, I believe, from Surf Lifesaving New Zealand. And that one quick point as well is that's not in addition to the funding that you guys have already discussed at, I believe, a council meeting, but it's just important that it gets through the formal process. So if you as a fire committee were then to approve or recommend this, it would go to council, who would then approve that funding to go into the long-term plan or the 21-22 budget year.
Member Jackson.
Happy to move that recommendation, Chairman.
So you're happy to move. Basically, we've now got 1.2 that we received the report, the 2.2, which I think has been circulated, that the fire committee recommends to council approve the 1.8 million additional capital budget for 2021/22. This comprises a carry forward of 1.26 million, additional funding to be completed to complete the Foxton Beach Surf Club building upgrade of $250,000. That the fire committee notes that 150,000 of the additional budget will be funded externally. These proposals will be presented to the council for approval at the next meeting on the 8th of September. And then 2.4 is the matter or decision is be recognised as not significant. So you're moving that. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Christine. Any discussion on the resolution? Clear for everybody? We'll be coming back to full council. All those in favour, please say aye. Hands. Carried. Thank you very much. Our next item is page now 153. Our Treasury report. Dare I say it, Doug has left the building and interest rates are on their way up. Just to carry on a theme from previously. I'm not saying our current CFO is responsible.
And it didn't sound like it was inferred at all either.
Thank you.
I'll take the report as read on this one, and I think there may be a few questions coming through around how we manage from a treasury management perspective that will probably answer what I might cover now.
Okay, but are there any questions? Member Brian?
Chairman, I just had some concerns about not only the increase that we will get in interest, but also the fact that we've got some pretty big programs in front of us, and it's amazing that we managed them so well last year, and I think that's a feather in a lot of caps. But I just wonder how robust our cash flow planning is to just make sure that we use our money in the best possible way.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I think we have got a lot better in this organisation over the last 6 months with forecasting and using the tools to actively forecast and understand what projects are happening when. And I think the conversations are coming along well in terms of it from within a year perspective. From an overall perspective, I guess we have Bancorp advising us in terms of Treasury, and Miles from Bancorp is going to come in at the next meeting in September to give everyone a bit of a view of how we manage Treasury within the organisation and discuss risks and how we attack them, and give you a chance to ask any questions as well. But from I guess from a Treasury management perspective and a planning perspective, just to give you a bit of comfort, we've had some strategy sessions with Miles looking at what this council needs to make sure they've set in place to firstly repay the borrowings that are coming due. So we actually have nothing. We've got about $12 million that's coming due in April 22. And we're already looking at securing the replacement of that borrowing at the next LGFA tranche that's coming up on the 8th of September. What we can do in that space, for example, is set in place a forward start fixed rate bond. So what effectively that does is you can order it now, set in place the pricing now, so that it activates when our borrowings become due. And so we're looking to do that in September for the borrowings that we've got that we have coming due next year. So that puts us in a good place in terms of liquidity management, and I think it's something that Standard & Poor's were looking at for us to do to make sure that we could move forward in terms of our ratings. And as well, another thing that we're looking to do is borrow around $8 million again in September, but starting in and around May, when we know that we'll have a significant amount of our capital coming due. So we are actively looking at that space. And to give you some idea of costings, it's still to be confirmed, I know, in terms of where the OCR is going to go and different interest rates given COVID, but those rates for us, for those bonds, we're sitting in around 2.3, 2.27 in terms of interest rates. So we're still sitting pretty well and probably lower than where we thought we would originally be in terms of interest rates. So hopefully that answers your question in terms of liquidity management and how we manage the cash flow.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
So just to clarify, so if we look on page 163 of the agenda, we've got that complicated little graph, if you want to call it that, where we're talking about Horowhenua DC debt and cover. So what you're saying is at the moment we've got a little, not a hole, but there is a potential underfunding in the June 26, 27, 28, 29 bucket. Is that what you're saying? We'll actually, by doing those strategies that you've just talked about, we'll push those that little graph further along the line. Is that what you're saying?
Yep, that's absolutely right. So when we do borrow those two fixed rate bonds, both to make sure we've got cash flow for when we spend our capital project this year, but also to make sure that we've got the funding available to repay borrowings that are coming due. When we set those bonds, they'll be out to 27, 28, which will make sure that our timing of our borrowings fits in line with the policy. What that also does is that makes sure we've got a reasonable amount of fixed debt versus floating debt so that we're not exposed to changes in the interest rate.
Okay. Member Brian?
Chairman, I just wondered too in future if it could be simply added how we're complying with policy around the various parameters of our borrowing and treasury, just once in the quarterly report, just showing that we are meeting all the policy requirements.
Can I just refer you to page 165? There's little tick boxes there. Do you want some more than that, or is that sufficient?
It could be that I didn't see that, Mr. Chairman.
If you could just, if that's sufficient. I mean, I understand that it's complicated sometimes to actually ensure that we're both complying now and in the future based on our.
No, that's fine. I missed.
That's fine.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Any other questions on our Treasury report? Okay, so I'm happy to move the recommendations on page 153. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Deputy Mayor Joe. Any further discussion on the resolutions? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Your hand, aye, carried. Our next item is our audit recommendation, page 165.
Thank you. So through the last meeting, we agreed to them that we would come forward. So at the last meeting, Stephen Lucy talked through the management letter, and because it wasn't that long ago, it did actually highlight, outline where we were at in terms of the program, in terms of trying to clear some of those items off that management letter. This report, which we'll provide on a quarterly or in a bi-monthly basis or by meeting basis, will give you a bit of an update in terms of where we currently sit in terms of what's proposed to be resolved and when and what status of items are complete.
Thank you. Any questions on this? Can I make a suggestion that the next, won't be for the September, but it'll be the October meeting, that when you make changes, you actually use a different colour, so you can actually quickly see what has actually changed from what you put in this report. This helps us trying to remember what was said last time and just what's been actioned or what's moved. Is that possible?
Absolutely, and apologies, I noted as well, I hadn't necessarily explained very well. I've got the colours there for what's urgent, etc., but I haven't necessarily labelled them for each one, so I'll make sure that that's done as well.
Yep. Councillor Pitahira.
Page 172, the landfill valuation. My question is just around timing for that, and if it was something that we needed to know sooner, why it wouldn't be considered urgent rather than necessary.
It's a good question. It comes, I guess, audit or label them from that perspective in terms of what they see, whether it's urgent or necessary. But we have made sure with all the valuations for this annual report that they've all been done and are completed, so that we shouldn't have any issue in terms of any of the valuations going forward.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. In terms of, you know, why it's put out and not included for this financial year, but I guess I was referring to in light of decisions that are coming sooner rather than later. That information, business cases and whatnot.
You mean around the future of the landfill side of things? Yeah, so that, I guess for us from a financial side, that information is ready to feed into whatever it needs to from that side of things.
Okay. Councillor Sam?
Yeah, my question's just related to page 169. There's reference there to improvements to the risk register being required there, and I think it's in the context of the Alliance.
Yep.
My question's more around risk reporting more generally, because obviously we've started to get more risk reporting through individual activity areas and obviously project related risk reporting. But right now, I don't think this committee has ever seen a risk register, you know, with our 10 biggest risks or anything like that. So I guess a question to you, Chair, is, in terms of having confidence around the improvements that has been made to the risk register around the Alliance, that's one thing. But in terms of just risk reporting and risk management generally, have you got any thoughts around, how we can be assured that that the risk register is an effective tool and is actually guiding, in terms of our work program and the organisation's work program?
Yeah, I've got some comments to make. Now, the Chief Executive also might want to back me up. He appointed a new risk person with a more emphasis on risk, and they began their journey 3 weeks ago. I had an informal discussion with that person this morning. We were hoping to have it in person when we set it up, and so hopefully at the next meeting we can actually start that journey. I agree with you that, in my opinion, while risk may be being well managed in the organisation, we're not getting the detail of that assurance that's part of our role. And that's why I was really pleased to see that health and safety report, where it gave us a lot of assurance that health and safety is not only alive and well, but is actually performing, and there are some improvement programs in place. So that's what I would be looking for in terms of progressively moving the risk discussion forward by the committee. Now, you may or may not remember, we did actually, the committee had an informal workshop about 12 months ago with Steve Maggi, right? And because of workload and other pressures, that sort of didn't happen. So I think now the Chief Executive has appointed someone with that focus, and I am hopeful that we'll now start to see some good reporting, well, actually some good framework developed, and then some consistent reporting across the whole organisation, including the Alliance. Mr. Chief Executive, do you want to comment?
No, and look, I just echo the comments that you've made, Chair. We have determined that we need a dedicated resource in this area. So part of the structure that the new business performance manager role, which is obviously Mrs. Huria, part of her task in the next little while is to actually look at what requirements there may be around a dedicated resource, but that will be done as you've outlined, and we will make sure that we've actually got a good reporting mechanism back to the council, because I actually agree with Councillor Jennings that they should be highlighted, at least the top 10 risks that we've got. And interestingly enough, they actually evolve. They're not sort of ones that are static, and we've got some ones looming at the moment, and one of the ones that we've already highlighted is a risk around resourcing, and that I'm sure is the one of the top risks that will be covered when we've got reporting back to the FAR committee.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Sam?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's pleasing to hear.
Yeah, I've got Member Jackson, and then I've got Councillor Victoria.
Chairman, it's not my place to pass information, but I think Jacinta would back me up. Capity actually do this risk management quite well, and David has a very good relationship, I know, with the Chief Executive there. I think it'd be worth having a look at their process rather than perhaps trying to reinvent the wheel.
Look, it's actually a very good point, and if there's Mrs. Huria, if you're listening still, I think you're still there, and we'll take that on board. And look, there is the possibility of actually having some shared resources across our boundary as well, in that respect.
Councillor Victoria?
Yeah, on page 170 under 4.1, there where it states recording of complaints not in line with DIA, where it's marked urgent and then the current status reads that it's in progress. Just when you read the recommendations, and it's got management comment around awaiting outcome of 3 waters. And then there's a reference to Palmerston North City Council manually reviewing jobs for Horowhenua District. So do we do the same, or are we doing nothing in that space? Because it wasn't very clear, or I've completely misread it.
I'll have to come back. I don't know all the details of it in terms of that specific one, but I know there are particular issues around, for example, the DAA requires you to record, for example, in the stormwater space. If a different customer rings for the same issue 5 times, then you're required to record it 5 times versus actually recording it once. And that clarification in the way people are treating it requires sometimes some manual intervention to go through each call and make sure it's in line with what the DIA expects versus what councils expect. And I think there's been a bit of conversation about whether councils agree with that being the most practical way to record something, because it may not give, for example, the best picture of what's happening. If you've got 100 calls about the same issue, it might look like there's a really bad, there's larger issues across the district rather than just based on volume. So that just gives you a bit of a, so it is actively being worked on, but I don't know the specific details of this council.
And can I just add, it's common across a number of councils who have used the Palmerston North Palmerston North City Council's after hours service, and I know a number of councils that have got this issue and are working on it. Any other questions? So if we go back to page 167, we've got a recommendation there. Can I have a mover for that, please? Thank you, Councillor Victoria. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor David. Any further discussion? All those in favour, please say aye. Hands. Those against carried. It's carried. Our next item is our last one, page 213, committee actions. Probably doesn't need any explanation. I would like to note, though, that the item on page 215, report item number 21/257, I think it's complete, and I think that can actually be as noted as complete and should be withdrawn from the next report. That's the way I read it. Is that correct? Not getting any disagreements. Any comments, questions on this item? Can't see any. Can I have a mover for the recommendation on 213, please? Thank you, Councillor Ross. Seconded, Councillor Victoria. Any discussion on the resolution? All those in favour, raise your hand. Aye. Those against, carried. Being no further business, I declare the meeting closed, and thank you very much for your virtual attendance. Thank you, and I hope everyone is staying safe in their bubbles.
Before everyone signs off, just if I am able to, just have maybe 5 or 10 minutes just to give an update on a couple of things, no different to what we've done in the past, where we just have a post-meeting briefing. There's just 3 or 4 items that I'd like to cover. So if we were able